The uplifting song of the skylark surely has to be the quintessential sound of spring across our farmed and grassy landscapes. It's also one of the Mendip Hills National Landscape's champion species. These are a small select suite of 8 key species which thrive in quality habitats. These canaries in a coal mine are a good measure of environmental conditions and help by both driving conservation initiatives and raising awareness of the habitats in which they live. Like many farmland birds, skylark numbers have fallen dramatically since the 1970s. Despite still being a relatively common species, it has now been placed on the UK's Red List, highlighting all those birds of conservation concern. However, a healthy breeding population of skylarks still persists across the Mendip Hills, with strongholds on the south-facing grasslands, farmed pastures on the plateau and around the edges of Chew Valley and Blagdon Lakes. Recent surveys found it still to be present in 28 of the 51 tetrads, or 2 kilometre squares, across the Mendip Hills. Despite its nondescript looks, the skylark possesses an astonishing and much celebrated song, which is performed while rising high into the sky and only ending when it sails back down to earth. Stephen Moss is a well-known local birder who lives close to the Mendips. He's also author of Skylarks with Rosie, a book about spring in Somerset.
The skylark is actually the definitive LBJ, little brown job. Although if you see it well, it has a lovely little crest and it's really quite a plump bird, quite a bit bigger than a sparrow. But it's when you hear it, you hear them, and we're hearing them now above us, and they launch themselves into the air and they just pour out this extraordinary, like a river of song that seems to go on for hours on end. Absolutely beautiful. I think the Mendips are so important for skylarks because the habitat is absolutely brilliant. It's not farmed intensively. You can see you've got this lovely field full of buttercups, you've got areas of long grass, you've got areas of shorter grass. They like a bit of variety. Although they spend their life, the males spend their life in the air singing, they of course breed on the ground. So they need an area where there's plenty of food, plenty of habitat, and that's why they live here on the Mendips. I live quite near the Mendip Hills and I occasionally come up here in winter, and believe me, no self-respecting skylark would be able to stay here. It's too cold, there's not enough food. So what do? They literally fly about 10 miles. We can actually see the coast from here, and they fly down there, and on my local patch, which is on the coast in Somerset, I hear skylarks in the breeding season, perhaps 1 or 2 pairs, but in winter there are dozens of them there, and that's where they feed before they come back here in early spring to breed. Skylarks, like all songbirds, have a race against time when they nest, when they breed. So they nest on the ground, they build a small scrape, barely a nest at all, and they lay their eggs in that, and then they will raise the young, and then they'll have another brood of young, as long as that first lot have gone off all right, and then another, and sometimes even a fourth. And they need to do that during the spring and summer months, so that by the autumn, the young are large enough and healthy enough to survive. I was born in 1960, and since then, we have lost, mislaid, if you like, 2 million pairs of skylarks, and that is a shocking statistic. Skylarks used to be the most widespread bird in Britain back in the 60s and early 70s. They were found more or less everywhere, found in I think 98% of the 10 kilometre squares that were surveyed in those days. Now they've dropped down. They're still found across Britain, but in lower numbers. They're struggling in farmland because farmland is still farmed so intensively in Britain, despite all the knowledge we have about the fact that we need to find a balance between providing food, producing food, and helping wildlife. We still farm too intensively, and a bird like the skylark simply can't survive on intensive farms. One of the biggest problems for any bird that nests on the ground is that its nest, eggs and chicks, are very vulnerable. So crows, of course, can come down. There's a lot of crows around here. They can come down and steal the eggs and chicks. But probably worse than that is the fact that So many people will come here to walk their dogs, but they let them off the lead and the dogs are curious and they will snuffle out, they'll find a skylark's nest and either disturb the birds or trample the eggs. So what we need to do, of course, as responsible dog owners is either keep our dogs on the lead when we come here, or frankly, don't let your dogs off the lead or even run with your dogs during the breeding season. I think in Britain we have a problem with farming, but not necessarily with farmers. And some very good farmers in Britain that I've met do things like they'll set aside a little bit of land and let the grass grow longer, and it's called a skylark plot. And what it means is those skylarks have then got somewhere to nest where the predators like crows can't see them because the vegetation's a bit longer. They've got areas perhaps where they can feed that are less intensively farmed, particularly around the edges of fields. And a skylark doesn't need that much room as long as there's some. The problem is, it's when farming takes the crop and takes it right the way up to the edge, it destroys hedges, there's no insects around. You know, really intensive farming using a lot of chemicals is very bad news, not just for skylarks, of course, but for all birds. One of the biggest problems here in Somerset and on the Mendips is there's been a move over the past few decades from hay to silage. Hay was a very in tune with nature way of harvesting the grass. Silage isn't. Silage is cut not in late summer, but in early summer, even spring. What we need to do with any kind of farming here is work in tune with the wildlife. Find out, for example, when the skylarks are likely to have fledged, the young are away from the nest, and then you can cut the hay. Farmers, conservationists, landowners, and especially politicians need to realise that a skylark is part of our heritage here.
So how can you improve the fortunes of this iconic bird across the Mendip Hills? Take part in breeding bird surveys and send in your records to both the National Landscape team and the British Trust for Ornithology. Keep your dogs on a lead when walking through grassland and arable areas during the nesting season, which runs from March to August. And campaign for the reduced use of pesticides and an alteration of grass cutting on public open spaces where skylarks are known to visit and breed.
I think we care about the skylark as a nation because they are, along with the nightingale and perhaps even more so, the bird that appears in more culture and music than any other bird. The most requested classical piece of music is the Lark Ascending by Vaughan Williams because it mimics the sound of the skylark. And for me, skylarks are just part from all the way from my childhood. Everywhere I've ever lived there are skylarks, but there are fewer of them than there used to be. You can argue that a skylark is worthless. It doesn't provide anything for our economic benefit. But I would argue that a skylark is not worthless, it's priceless.